You may have noticed something painful but strangely consistent in life. The very people you lifted up, defended, supported, and gave your time to are often the ones who turn away, disappoint you, or even betray you when you least expect it. When you help someone, especially in moments when they feel lost, broken, or incapable of handling their own life, something subtle begins to happen beneath the surface that most people never notice. On the outside, it looks simple. You solve a problem, you offer support, you give advice, or you provide emotional or even material assistance. But internally, in the psychology of the person receiving help, a far more complex process begins to unfold. Human beings are not purely rational receivers of kindness. They interpret help through the lens of identity, pride, and emotional strength. And depending on the state of that inner world, the same act of help can be experienced in completely different ways. A mature and emotionally stable mind usually processes help as gratitude. It recognizes limitation without shame, acknowledges support without resistance, and integrates the experience into personal growth. In such a case, the person feels connected, appreciative, and often more respectful toward the one who helped them. However, not every mind operates from that level of emotional maturity. In individuals who carry insecurity, unresolved emotional wounds, or a fragile sense of self-worth, help does not always land as relief. Instead, it can quietly transform into something heavier and more uncomfortable, even if it is not consciously acknowledged. This discomfort arises from an invisible psychological burden, the sense of indebtedness. When someone receives repeated help, especially in situations where they feel they should have been capable of handling things themselves, a subtle internal pressure begins to form. It is not always spoken and often not even fully understood by the person experiencing it. It exists as a quiet tension between gratitude and pride. On one hand, they recognize that the help was necessary. On the other hand, they feel a silent disturbance in their self-image, as if their independence has been questioned or weakened by the very assistance they received. For many individuals, this internal discomfort is difficult to sit with. Emotional debt is not like financial debt that can be measured or repaid in clear terms. It is ambiguous, intangible, and therefore psychologically harder to process. Because of this ambiguity, the mind seeks a way to restore balance, not through repayment or acknowledgement, but through reinterpretation. Instead of carrying gratitude, which requires emotional openness and humility, the mind may unconsciously choose a different path, reducing the perceived importance of the helper. This is where the transformation begins. The helper, who once appeared essential, slowly becomes reclassified in the mind of the receiver. Their role is minimized, their impact softened, and their importance reframed. This is not always a conscious act of ingratitude. Rather, it is a psychological defense mechanism. By lowering the significance of the person who helped them, the receiver reduces the internal pressure of feeling indebted. If the help is mentally downgraded, then the emotional debt feels lighter, more manageable, and less threatening to their sense of independence. At the same time, there is another layer to this process that operates silently in the background. Many people struggle with the idea of being seen as weak or dependent. Accepting help places them in a position that contradicts their ideal self-image. To resolve this contradiction, the mind may reconstruct the narrative in a way that protects self-esteem. Over time, the memory of being helped becomes less emotionally vivid, while the memory of personal effort becomes more dominant. The helper fades into the background not because their contribution lacked value, but because the psyche is actively reshaping the story to preserve a sense of autonomy and inner strength. In weak or unhealed minds, this restructuring can also be accompanied by subtle emotional resistance. The presence of the helper may unconsciously trigger reminders of vulnerability, creating discomfort that the person does not know how to articulate. As a result, Distance begins to form. What once felt like closeness now carries an emotional weight that is difficult to explain, leading the individual to gradually detach from the very person who supported them during their lowest moments. Human memory is not a fixed recording of events. It is a living reconstruction that changes depending on emotion, identity, and time. What people remember is not always what happened, but what their mind decides is easier to carry forward. This becomes especially evident in relationships where one person has significantly helped another. In the moment of struggle, the receiver of help is often deeply aware of their vulnerability. They feel the weight of limitation, the pressure of uncertainty, and the relief that comes when someone steps in to support them. In that moment, gratitude may feel natural, even overwhelming. Yet as time passes and circumstances improve, something subtle begins to shift in how the story is remembered. As individuals regain strength, independence, or social stability, their internal identity begins to change. The version of themselves that once needed help becomes uncomfortable to revisit. It represents weakness, dependency, or lack of control, and most human beings are instinctively driven to protect their self-image. To maintain a sense of confidence and autonomy, the mind begins to reorganize past experiences in a way that aligns with the present identity. This process is rarely deliberate or conscious. It happens gradually through repeated reinterpretation of memories where emotional emphasis is shifted and certain details are softened while others are amplified. In this restructuring of memory, the role of the helper often begins to change. At first, the helper is remembered clearly as someone essential, someone who provided direction, support, or stability during a difficult period. But as emotional distance from that vulnerable version of the self increases, the presence of the helper can start to feel less central in the narrative. The mind begins to redistribute credit, sometimes subtly, sometimes significantly, toward personal effort, resilience, or external circumstances. What was once experienced as receiving support can slowly be reframed as getting through it, where the emphasis is placed more on survival than on assistance. This psychological adjustment serves a protective function. Many individuals find it difficult to maintain a strong self-image while holding on to the memory of dependency. If the past version of themselves appears too weak or too reliant on others, it can create discomfort in the present identity. To resolve this tension, the mind reduces the emotional intensity of those memories. The helper, who once stood at the center of the experience, becomes less visible in the internal story. Their actions are not necessarily forgotten, but they are no longer felt with the same emotional weight they once carried. Over time, this can lead to a quiet distortion in perception. The person who was once deeply grateful may genuinely believe that their progress was primarily self-driven. This is not always a conscious attempt to erase someone else's contribution, but rather the result of continuous internal editing. Memory is influenced by repetition, and the stories we tell ourselves about our past become stronger each time they are retold internally. If the narrative of independence is repeated often enough, it begins to overshadow the narrative of assistance, even if both are equally true. Another important aspect of this process is emotional distance. As people grow and move forward in life, they naturally separate themselves from earlier versions of their experiences. The emotional state they were in during moments of struggle becomes harder to access. Without that emotional connection, the memory of help loses its original intensity. It becomes more abstract, less felt, and therefore less influential in shaping present attitudes. The helper transitions from being a deeply significant figure in lived experience to becoming a character in a remembered story, and even that character may gradually fade as new experiences accumulate. In some cases, this rewriting also serves as a way to avoid discomfort associated with indebtedness. Acknowledging that someone played a crucial role in one's growth can create a subtle psychological pressure. It requires humility, recognition, and sometimes a sense of obligation that people may not want to carry indefinitely. To relieve this internal pressure, the mind unconsciously minimizes the role of external support. This does not always come from ill intent, but from a desire to maintain emotional freedom and psychological ease while constructing a coherent sense of self over time. Dependency begins in a place of need, not choice. When a person is struggling, overwhelmed, or unable to manage a situation on their own, receiving help feels like relief. In that moment, dependency is not questioned because survival or emotional stability becomes the priority. The presence of someone capable, supportive, or guiding is experienced as safety. However, what is often overlooked is that dependency is not a stable emotional state. It is temporary by nature, and once the immediate need begins to fade, the psychological relationship between the receiver and the helper starts to shift in ways that are subtle but powerful. As individuals begin to regain their sense of control, even slightly, they start to reconnect with their desire for independence. Human identity is deeply tied to autonomy, and most people, regardless of how much they may have needed help at one point, eventually want to see themselves as self-sufficient again. This transition is natural and often necessary for personal growth. However, what complicates this process is that the person who once provided support can become psychologically associated with the earlier state of dependency. The helper becomes a living reminder of a version of the self that felt weak, uncertain, or incapable. This association can create internal discomfort. Even if the help was given with kindness and genuine intention, it can still become linked to vulnerability in the receiver's mind. As independence returns, the mind seeks to distance itself from anything that reinforces the memory of dependence. This is where resistance begins to form. The same presence that once felt stabilizing can start to feel emotionally heavy or even intrusive, not because of any change in the helper's behavior, but because of a change in internal perception. Resistance does not always appear as open rejection. In many cases, it develops gradually through subtle shifts in behavior. Communication may become less frequent, emotional openness may decrease, and the tone of interaction may lose its earlier warmth. On the surface, everything may seem normal, but underneath, a psychological boundary is being constructed. This boundary is not necessarily aimed at the helper as a person, but at the emotional state they represent. The mind is trying to separate the present self from the past condition of dependency, and distancing from the helper becomes part of that process. Another important dimension of this resistance is the desire to reclaim personal identity. When someone has relied heavily on another person, even temporarily, there can be an internal struggle to reassert individuality. The helper's presence may unconsciously feel like a continuation of dependence, even when no help is currently being given. This creates tension between appreciation and self-definition. To resolve this tension, the receiver may begin to resist suggestions, advice, or even reminders associated with the person who once helped them. What was once guidance is now interpreted as interference, not because the content has changed, but because the emotional context has. This transformation is often confusing for both sides. The helper may still see the relationship through the lens of care and continuity, while the receiver now experiences it through the lens of independence and separation. This difference in perception creates emotional distance. The helper may interpret this shift as ingratitude or betrayal, while the receiver may see it as necessary growth. In reality, it is often a psychological adjustment rather than a deliberate act of rejection. Resistance can also be fueled by an internal desire to prove capability. Once a person begins to rebuild their confidence, they may feel an unconscious need to demonstrate that they are no longer in need of assistance. This can lead to subtle opposition toward the very individuals who once provided that assistance. Advice may be dismissed more quickly, emotional input may be minimized, and previous reliance may be reframed as something temporary and no longer relevant. The more the person wants to affirm their independence, the more they may resist anything that symbolically represents dependence. Over time, this resistance can become embedded in behavior patterns, shaping how the relationship evolves. What once began as gratitude-driven connection slowly transforms into a dynamic where distance feels necessary for psychological balance. The helper remains tied to a past version of the receiver, while the receiver is focused on reinforcing a new identity that no longer includes that dependency. Relationships are built on a fragile sense of balance that is not always visible, but is always felt. This balance is not only about effort or time, it is about emotional exchange, recognition, and mutual participation in each other's lives. When two people contribute to each other in relatively equal ways, even if differently, there is a natural rhythm that keeps the connection stable. However, when one person consistently gives more than the other, whether in emotional support, problem solving, guidance, or even sacrifice, that rhythm begins to shift. Overgiving slowly changes the structure of the relationship in ways that are often invisible at first but become emotionally significant over time. When someone gives repeatedly without receiving a similar level of emotional return, the relationship begins to lose symmetry. The giver may not initially notice this imbalance because their motivation is often rooted in care, empathy, or a desire to help. In the beginning, the act of giving feels meaningful, even fulfilling, but human psychology is not immune to patterns. Over time, the mind begins to register the lack of reciprocity, even if the person consciously denies it. This creates a quiet internal tension that grows beneath the surface of the relationship. On the receiving side, a different psychological process unfolds. When a person is consistently supported, guided, or emotionally sustained by someone else, they begin to adjust their internal expectations of the relationship. What was once perceived as support may gradually become normalized as part of the connection. The receiver may not intentionally take the giver for granted, but familiarity can reduce emotional awareness of effort. The more stable the support becomes, the less visible it feels, even though its importance remains unchanged. This divergence in perception is where imbalance takes root. The giver starts to feel emotionally invested in ways that are not fully mirrored by the receiver, while the receiver may begin to assume stability without recognizing the continuous input required to maintain it. The result is a growing gap between emotional expectation and emotional experience. The giver may begin to feel unacknowledged, while the receiver may feel increasingly comfortable, unaware that the equilibrium is slowly breaking. As this imbalance deepens, silent expectations often begin to form within the giver, even if they are never expressed aloud. These expectations are not necessarily demands, but rather emotional hopes for recognition, appreciation, or reciprocation. The problem is not the existence of expectations, but the fact that they often remain unspoken. When emotional investment increases without communication, the mind naturally begins to anticipate a return, even if that return was never explicitly agreed upon. This unspoken anticipation becomes a source of vulnerability. On the other side, the receiver may not be aware of these internal expectations. From their perspective, the relationship may still feel functional or even supportive without tension. This difference in internal experience creates a gap that is difficult to bridge because it is not based on a single event, but on accumulated emotional patterns. The giver begins to feel increasingly unseen, while the receiver continues to operate within a structure they perceive as normal. Over time, this imbalance can lead to emotional distortion. The giver may start to interpret lack of reciprocity as disregard, even if no harm was intended. The emotional weight of continuous giving without equal return can create fatigue, frustration, or quiet disappointment. These feelings may not surface immediately, but they accumulate internally. Eventually, what once felt like generosity begins to feel like emotional depletion. Meanwhile, the receiver may also experience subtle discomfort, often without understanding its source. Being consistently supported can create an unconscious awareness of imbalance, even if it is not clearly articulated. This can lead to internal unease, especially when the receiver senses that they are not contributing at the same level. Instead of addressing this imbalance directly, some individuals unconsciously distance themselves from the source of it as a way to restore emotional neutrality within themselves. In this way, overgiving does not simply create gratitude or dependency, it reshapes the emotional architecture of the relationship. It alters how each person perceives their role, their value, and their place within the connection. What begins as care can slowly transform into a structure where emotional equilibrium is disrupted, leading both sides to experience the relationship in fundamentally different ways that continue to drift apart over time. Human psychology assigns value not only based on usefulness, but based on effort. What a person fights for, suffers for, and slowly builds through personal struggle becomes deeply embedded in their identity. It carries emotional weight, memory, and a sense of ownership that cannot be easily replicated through external assistance. This is why people often respect what they have earned more than what they have received. Effort creates meaning, and meaning creates attachment. Without effort, even something valuable can feel strangely distant or emotionally light in the long run. When something is achieved through personal struggle, every step of the process becomes part of the story. The difficulties, the failures, the persistence, and the eventual success all merge into a narrative of self-construction. In that narrative, the individual becomes both the creator and the witness of their growth. This dual role strengthens their emotional connection to the outcome. It is not just the result that matters, but the journey that shaped their identity. Because of this, the achievement feels irreplaceable, even if others could have helped along the way. In contrast, when success, stability, or emotional support is given too easily, the psychological structure is different. The receiver benefits from the outcome, but does not necessarily experience the same depth of internal transformation. Without struggle, the emotional imprint is lighter. The mind may appreciate the assistance in the moment, but over time, it does not anchor the same level of meaning to it. What is given is received, but not always integrated into identity in a lasting way. This difference becomes especially visible in relationships where one person consistently helps another. The helper may believe that their support will naturally translate into lasting appreciation or loyalty. However, appreciation that is not reinforced by personal struggle often remains situational rather than permanent. It exists strongly during moments of need but fades when the need disappears. Once the individual reaches a point of independence, their focus shifts toward what they have achieved on their own rather than what was provided by others. This shift is not necessarily a conscious rejection of help. It is more of a reorientation of identity. As people grow, they tend to define themselves through their own actions and resilience. The mind naturally gravitates towards self-authored experiences because they reinforce autonomy. In this process, external contributions may become less emotionally central, even if they were essential at an earlier stage. The role of the helper becomes less visible not because it lacked importance, but because it does not align with the current narrative of self-sufficiency. Another important aspect of this dynamic is the way struggle creates emotional investment. When a person endures difficulty, their mind becomes deeply engaged in the outcome. Every obstacle overcome strengthens the sense of ownership over the result. This emotional investment is what makes achievements feel valuable long after the moment has passed. Without that investment, Outcomes may be beneficial, but they do not always carry the same psychological depth. They exist as facts rather than as emotionally significant milestones. Because of this, individuals often feel a stronger sense of pride in what they have personally endured than in what was made easier for them through external help. Even when assistance plays a crucial role in their progress, the emotional narrative tends to center around personal effort. This is not necessarily an act of denial, but a natural tendency of the human mind to prioritize experiences that reinforce strength, resilience, and independence. Over time, this can influence how people perceive those who help them during earlier stages of their growth. The helper may be acknowledged in principle, but the emotional intensity of that acknowledgement may not match the intensity of the assistance that was originally provided. The mind prioritizes what reinforces identity in the present over what reflects dependency in the past. As a result, respect becomes more closely tied to struggle than to support, shaping how relationships are remembered and valued long after the original experiences have passed. Guilt is not always loud or obvious. In many human experiences, it exists quietly beneath awareness, shaping behavior without being directly recognized. When a person has been significantly helped during a vulnerable phase of their life, especially in moments where they felt incapable, lost, or emotionally dependent, a subtle psychological imprint is formed. Even if gratitude is present in the moment, there can also be an underlying awareness of imbalance. The person knows, at some level, that someone else carried a burden they could not carry themselves. This awareness does not always remain conscious, but it does not disappear either. As time passes and circumstances improve, the individual begins to reconstruct their sense of self. They move from dependency toward autonomy, from vulnerability toward strength. In this transition, the memory of being helped can become emotionally complex. On one hand, it represents relief and survival during a difficult period. On the other hand, it can also represent a version of the self that feels uncomfortable to revisit. This discomfort is where unconscious guilt begins to take shape. It is not necessarily guilt about wrongdoing, but rather an emotional residue linked to dependence and imbalance. The human mind often seeks to avoid prolonged discomfort. When guilt is not consciously processed or expressed, it does not simply vanish. Instead, it finds indirect pathways of expression. One of the most common pathways is emotional distance. Without realizing it, a person may begin to reduce contact, limit emotional openness, or gradually step away from interactions that remind them of their past vulnerability. This distancing is not always intentional or rational. It is often a psychological strategy to reduce internal tension. The presence of the person who provided help can unintentionally activate this internal discomfort. Even if the helper behaves normally and without expectation, their presence may serve as a reminder of a time when the receiver was dependent. This reminder can trigger an internal conflict between gratitude and self-image. While gratitude acknowledges the importance of the help received, self-image seeks to maintain a sense of independence and strength. The coexistence of these two emotional states can create subtle psychological pressure. To resolve this tension, the mind may unconsciously choose avoidance as a form of relief. By creating emotional or physical distance, the individual reduces exposure to the reminder of their past vulnerability. Over time, this distance becomes normalized. What begins as a subtle reduction in communication can evolve into a consistent pattern of detachment. The helper may perceive this as rejection or betrayal, while the receiver may interpret it as a natural progression of life. Neither perspective fully captures the unconscious emotional mechanics taking place beneath the surface. Another layer of this process is the desire to protect identity. As individuals grow stronger, they often invest heavily in maintaining a self-image of independence. This identity is important for confidence, social interaction, and internal stability. However, acknowledging deep dependency in the past can feel like a threat to that identity. Instead of integrating both strength and vulnerability as parts of a continuous story, the mind may separate them. The current self is seen as independent, while the past self is quietly distanced or minimized. In this separation, the role of the helper can become emotionally complicated. The helper represents a bridge to a version of the self that the individual is no longer comfortable inhabiting. As a result, maintaining close emotional proximity can feel internally conflicting. Even without conscious intent, reducing contact becomes a way to preserve psychological comfort. The distance is not always a reflection of feelings toward the helper, but rather a reflection of the individual's relationship with their own past. Over time, this unconscious distancing can solidify into a stable pattern. What once was closeness becomes formality, and what once was emotional connection becomes memory. The helper's significance remains real, but it is no longer actively integrated into the present emotional framework of the relationship. Instead, it exists as a quiet acknowledgement in the background, while the present interaction is shaped more by the need for psychological balance and identity preservation than by the history that originally connected the two individuals. So when you ask yourself why the people you helped sometimes become distant, cold, ungrateful, or even hurtful, the answer is often far deeper than simple betrayal. Human beings are emotionally complicated. They do not always respond to kindness with wisdom, and they do not always carry gratitude in a healthy way. Sometimes help heals people. Sometimes it exposes their insecurities. Sometimes it strengthens bonds. And sometimes it quietly awakens feelings they do not know how to face. The painful truth is that helping someone does not automatically guarantee loyalty, respect, or emotional permanence. Many people appreciate support only while they are still drowning. Once they regain stability, their relationship with the past begins to change. They reshape memories, reclaim independence, and distance themselves from whatever reminds them of weakness, dependence, or emotional debt. And unfortunately, the person who once stood beside them during darkness can become part of that uncomfortable reminder. But this understanding should not turn your heart bitter. It should make your wisdom sharper. There is a difference between kindness and self-erasure. There is a difference between helping people and sacrificing your emotional balance to save them. True generosity is healthy only when it is guided by awareness, boundaries, and emotional clarity. Do not stop being a person who helps others. The world already has enough indifference. But learn to give without attaching your worth to the response you receive afterward. Learn to support people without expecting them to carry your goodness forever in their memory, because the moment your peace depends on their gratitude, your kindness becomes a silent contract that reality rarely fulfills. Some people will remember your presence for the rest of their lives. Others will rewrite the story to protect their pride. Some will carry gratitude quietly in their hearts but never express it. Others will disappear the moment they no longer need you. This is not always cruelty. Often it is simply human nature struggling with guilt, insecurity, identity, and emotional discomfort. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this: your value was never meant to be measured by how faithfully others remember what you did for them. Your value exists in the integrity of your actions, in the compassion you carried, and in the strength it took to give without becoming hard in a world that often confuses kindness with weakness. Because in the end, the people you helped may forget your sacrifice, minimize your role, or walk away without explanation, but the person you become through genuine compassion, emotional wisdom, and inner restraint will remain with you long after every temporary relationship fades away.